thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Josie, for the lovely introduction. I just want to also to thank Rosa for collaborating with us on this event. And also special thanks to David and University of Westminster for hosting us in this beautiful venue. And it's also a very special moment for me. I once was a student here, and coming back here is very kind of special moment. But we have Laura and Carolina, two incredible writer and researcher who collaborated to Photography Plus. And I think if I want to start, it was a few weeks ago when we were talking about the logistic of the program and planning the timeline and everything. We end up talking about the vernacular photography for an hour, and at some point I did something that most of us doing these days. I asked ChatGPT, what is vernacular photography? And the response was very interesting, and it's I'm gonna read it, and then maybe we can start from that point. The response was vernacular photography refers to everyday, non-professional photographs, images made by ordinary people rather than artists, typically for personal, social, or functional purposes, such as family album, passport photo, ID cards, photo booth pictures, holiday snapshot, police or medical documentation, social media photos, which is, I think, is not wrong, but is kind of like feel insufficient because I think both of you in your text kind of like showing how vernacular photography is not just a type of photograph, why it's aesthetic, but it's a condition. And it kind of it has to do with the intention, the function, the circulation of the image, and the power as well. So I want to start from here. Laura, in your text, you highlight the gap in official photograph histories and how vernacular photography can kind of like fill those gaps. So if you can like a little bit explain about your piece, the images we saw, and give us an overview of the essay.
Yeah, sure, I'll tell you. So Bunker has defined how we understand vernacular photography in each of our essays. My definition is quite broad. Broadly, I was saying that the photography created outside of the structures of professional world. And we all know there are barriers and structures that make it harder for people in certain backgrounds to become a professional photographer. And that's been the case, and more so in the history of photography. So when you apply that to the archive, what work has been created over the past 80 or so years, a lot of that work is created from the people who managed to make it as a photographer. So that then means that personal biases or kind of structures of who is commissioning them to cover what stories, about what, from what angle, is all fed into that archive. And so there are going to be gaps, things that were just not interesting to the commissioning magazine or newspaper editors at the time, things that were deemed not important enough, plus perspectives of photographers who didn't get the chance to become a photographer. So the kind of photography that was created by ordinary people, maybe it was just documenting their families in their local area, maybe they had a hobby of photography, that these are now, of course, filling in some of those gaps in the archives. And a lot of the work that I mentioned in the essays is found in some way. A lot of it was almost lost. And so some of it is by photographers who were hobbyists or maybe wanted to be a bit longer, didn't quite make it, or it's families. So text, can you talk about the essay? East London photographer, Nigerian heritage, had amazing work that you could see in a fashion magazine, I would imagine, but didn't make it as a photographer, didn't store the work properly. It was almost thrown away and then rescued by his family. So that then, in the context of adding it to our collective archive, what we understand as life in East London, it fills in some gaps from the perspectives of young man living in a very multicultural area, and it being his home in a way that someone doing a reportage piece for Life magazine wouldn't quite get in that way. And a lot of the photographers who are families with a camera and they're just taking photos for their local area, these are things that would have been boss. They're often found in car boot sales. I think you might get a bit later in the days talk about collecting these kind of things, but they start to fill in some of the gaps. And another thing that I mentioned in the essay is Salford Archives, which is not actually an archive, but an Instagram account that just collates user-generated content of people from an area just outside Manchester that's had incredible layers and regeneration and generation over the years, from the Industrial Revolution to kind of fall of that, to rebuilding homes there, to what it is today, which is completely different. Of a really rapid building in the past 10 years in particular. So people have given their images into Salford Archives, and it shows not just the personal family shots, but there's lots of pictures of just the area, which doesn't exist in that way anymore. Buildings aren't there anymore. And the people who used to live there, the families, kind of culture and the communities. So you had this area that may have not been so interesting to the press in the UK at that time, starting to get, guess the gaps be further in or new perspectives be discovered. And it's usually by people, and that account is followed by people who are rarely from there. Could be have some following people who don't know Salford very well, but it means a lot to people to see their home, see their community in that way.
Yeah, thank you. And Carolina, I think in very contrast, you write about kind of like a shift from delay and displacement from vernacular photography to something more immediate and network, especially through the messenger app like Wider or WhatsApp, iMessage. How kind of like how does Marta's flower help you to frame your essay? If you can explain a little bit about the project itself and how you shape the idea of your essay as well.
Yeah, so Martha's Flower is the project that you might have seen so many images just right before. And it's what inspired and also what I used as an example for the piece. I think my thought process when I was invited to write about vernacular photography was to kind of question what that would look like in 100 years. Like, what are vernacular images that we are taking today, and what will that look like? How will collecting be possible? So kind of speculating, although in the text I write myself, speculating on future forms might risk being short-sighted. So it's more like kind of just throwing something out there and hoping to spark conversation, really. So what I did was starting from, and here is a disclaimer, I feel we always have to kind of disclaim what kind of bench of vernacular we're referring to. And in my piece and in my work, I started from personal documentation and binary making. So the family album, you could say. And I start by thinking about the word vernacular, and in language is referred to the informal, sort of less prestigious version of the spoken language, and then its relationship to photography, and it kind of echoing the same hierarchies by language. So it's the professionalification of photography to daily life. And starting from there, I think I was kind of reflecting on my own participation in visual culture, and in doing so was reminded of this project that I came across in Germany, was exhibited in Köln as part of the International Photo Fair. And I remember seeing it, and it really felt relatable because I also someone that lives abroad, so I am family in Italy, and I message with my mother daily. So seeing a project about this mother-daughter exchange happening in the intimacy of the private chat. And yeah, so maybe I'll say a bit more about the project. It's called Martha's Flowers. And it's a project in collaboration between a mother and a daughter. Marta is the mom, and Andrea Palassi is the daughter. She's an artist and research from Serbia. And so the project is this series of images, very it's just like such a specific scene. You always see different flowers. And then in the background, you always see the father in just the most dispersed sort of activities, whether it's laying down, it's reading, it's napping, it's, I presume, looking at TV. I can only imagine. And I mean, it's also funny looking at these images, the things that you can sort of imagine by looking at the frame. I can sort of picture Marta's taking these images from a matching sofa, for example. And then on the table, you see this just the wide variety of objects like scratch cards, chocolate wrappers, medicines, but also going back to the flowers. So Marta connects these flowers, she follows them, I would say, from my communal gardens, maybe neighbors. And it's sort of a way to send a message to her daughter, say, you're fine, right? Because it's not really about the flowers, although that's what ties this all together. And it was really interesting because thinking about the way I take photographs, going back to maybe what the parameters of vernacular are and the way I intend vernacular, so memory making, family album, everything. So not intended for public disclosure, right? So they're personal. There is no sort of like professional or artistic ambition to them. And I was also reflecting about time, not so much as a way to mark historical periods, but more of a factor for to make detachment possible, to make this process of dislocation, because the way we've seen, like for example, something that came to mind was the exhibition at Arles in praise of Banal photography. So that's all collected images. So there was this process. You have to think about the process that, you know, these images outlived their purpose. They outlived their the photographer, their owners. They were lost. They were found. They were collected. They were organized, and then they were shown, and then we could go and see them. And I'm thinking again about the way I participate in visual culture. I don't really take pictures like that anymore. I don't think there's a family album in my family past my 10th birthday. And we don't really print pictures as much. So what is the future of vernacular? How will we? And this was an example to kind of think about the collapse of that temporal gap between the moment an image is taken and the moment it becomes vernacular in a sense. And in the piece, and I think this also ties to Laura's piece, I'm reflecting about the concept of amateurism, amateurship, being an amateur, and the way, well, this obviously is my reading, so I'm very welcoming. But I feel it's kind of changed. It's kind of very much associated with the notion of kind of being incompetent nowadays. And again, my reading was that mainly back in the day because of the specialization and again, the privilege, because it was very like a white, you have access to, you can take a picture, you can't. Well, nowadays, taking pictures has become just an extension, a gesture, not a learned practice. So I guess the privilege is a bit more subtle in the way that it's not, I can't take an image, but it's maybe I can't, I don't have the same means as someone else to share it. I don't have the same network. The algorithm will not push it as much. And also like, obviously, barriers of ethnicity and gender and all of that. So it's just the notion of amateurship in vernacular photographers.
Yeah, I mean, we were both quite careful to not say that in our essays, I think. And I think the way that you describe or defined vernacular photography by likening it to language and how vernacular language is considered not the proper or professional way of speaking, that prejudice that we are conscious of really comes to light when you then look at the kind of communities that I've highlighted in my essay, you know, working class communities in Salford or immigrant communities in London, that the idea that we can't name a photographer who's working at, that their work is just as beautiful as photographers who went on to become known, that we can't call them photographers. They have to be vernacular photographers. And so I think your comparison to language really shows what that kind of prejudice is. I mean, our prejudice is around the way people speak from different kinds of backgrounds, and it really brings that to the fore.
And usually, another thing that I found interesting about our pieces is that you talk about these archives that were very close. Like it's just by chance that we get to see them, experience them today because they were very close, thrown away or lost. And in my piece, I also reflect about, at least there is some physicality to this, there's prints. Yeah. But what will that look like in the moment where we don't print images as much? And I guess that if the people that print images, because we have to look at, the average behavior, that maybe wouldn't necessarily be the same vernacular way images were printed back then. So I don't even know if we can look at that as a kind of like a parameter, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Like the people that print images today, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that's very common.
It's a lot of editing. I mean, I think it's why people are being encouraged to print images now. It's all been commercialized with these print your own photo books or your holiday or your family album or for anniversary. It's kind of commercialized and people are encouraged to edit very heavily, put a nice curation together, and it probably takes away from some of that chance that you get these kind of odd images or funny images that you find if you were just rummaging through someone else's attic.
Yeah, it's super aestheticized and super curated.
Yeah. And I think also like it's working with like the accessibility. I think the vernacular images we're producing these days is with our phone. We always having the access to the phone. I think for me it's like I take so many pictures with my phone. I do have a camera, but I rarely use it. But I think the reason I take so many pictures, I think missing I was checking since 2024, I took like 20,000 images on my phone. And with these like cloud-based things, I'm just don't delete anything. And it's a kind of like a resistance from me. It's coming from like a personal experience. My sister has like 4 or 5 albums. She's older than me. And I have 3 images from my whole childhood, which is inside is her album. So I'm kind of like resisting that kind of like not having the visual experience or like history of my childhood through like making more and more images of everything I'm making. So it's like I think making it accessible is shifting the vernacular. We're producing vernacular images or everyday photographs more than every other kind. And but I want to like ask a very general question that when we talk about vernacular photography today, what is more central for us? And also maybe my following question will be, is vernacular photography inherently exists in every single image? Because when we're looking at, for example, Nan Goldin's work, right? So they're producing a vernacular photograph has a full of like intention. What was the intention when the photographs were produced? The circulation and then presentation of the final image. So we can think about Nan Goldin photographs as a vernacular photography with the intention of taking pictures of her friends or like families around her, or was she borrowing that kind of like visual aesthetic to her work to kind of like convey us? We see that full of like intimacy. For example, like you see the Z-eye, the same thing we usually use the flash, maybe like in 18s, 90s, or like the composition. It's like very raw. It's like very kind of like using that kind of like naive tone or language, visual language that the vernacular has in her work, but it's like working very well. So I want to know like, what do you think about when you think about the vernacular? And also if you think is inherently exists in every single image, what's a kind of like the border between the edge of like vernacular or vernacular art photography?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite difficult to define because as soon as you find something that fits that category, there's how's your example. But to your point around the aesthetics of vernacular photography, there's definitely photographers who've come along since who, but very much like Dan Goldman's work, and think about somebody like Dash Snow, who was working as a magazine photographer, who did fashion brand shoots, but that very much started up as photographing friends, and it has that non-golden naivety about it, but obviously Golden had been around, people were familiar with that work. Was that an aesthetic? I think it has a lot more to do with the structures that I talk about. So you didn't mention this ton of the conditions, but what then happens afterwards, if that photographer then went on to become a big name, then do you look back at their work retroactively and say that was part of photography all along? Or was it only vernacular up until the point they started doing it seriously or professionally? It really calls into question exactly that issue of the barriers that stopped somebody from becoming a professional photographer or having the contacts to be able to put on an exhibition or get published or get representation. So it's the human mixture of those things. Is he that they're not doing it for a professional reason originally, but then they might start off just doing that and then actually become famous. I think about photographers whose work has been found, either they've become very successful or not successful, but famous and well appreciated in the art world. Vivian Mayer and that did this whole body of work that was discovered. She wasn't a professional photographer or an artist, or was she an artist? Get erased all those questions, and I don't think I'm equipped to answer because there seems to be a lot of hazy, grey areas between those borders.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that I wanted to pick up on. It's maybe your question, if or can you repeat the question about whether there's vernacular
Inherently exists in every single image we see.
That's something really interesting to me because I think about it as a series of images. So I also have to think about an image on itself wouldn't say much, especially, I mean, using this as an example, if I saw one image, it wouldn't necessarily convey what the whole series does, the kind of portrait of a family, of the situation, of a relationship between Andrea's mother and father, that can be like a portrait of a wider generation, portrait of society. That happens with this series. So I think that's kind of something interesting to think about in vernacular photography. Then the value doesn't necessarily lie in the singular image, but in the series, and whether that's the artist's choice or the collector or the person that will show certain images. I think about it in series, and I think that's a phenomenon that we also witness online. The same way we don't really, we see so many images, we see so many inputs, and we don't value the image on its own, but there's always a network around it, a network of the person that posted it. For example, who commented, who stacked, where it's taken, here's the song playing.
Yeah.
So I think that applies to vernacular photography as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about the quantity because the repeating the same image in different world every day is like kind of like an active vernacular photography as well. But Laura, I think in your essay you're talking about the vernacular images fill the gaps in archive that you mentioned a few times. Do you think like vernacular photography is like filling those gaps, and what are those gaps you're thinking in photography archive? Is it the role is to fill those gaps, or is showing or exposing?
Joy in the everyday activities and rituals people had, that I think it fills in the gaps to a certain extent because like, okay, great, and that wasn't in the archive, that wasn't known before, but then it does raise the question of what else we happen to see, because it is only by chance that we had texts, photos saved from the bin. And
Can you explain a little bit about the story of the text archive and what's happened around it? Because I think there is also like we talk about the element of the quantity of the vernacular, but I think there is like a kind of like a character of like lost and found, the chance and accident within the vernacular photography, which kind of like add the value to the archive. Vivian Meyer was one of the example, the because it was lost and then we found it, then we start looking at the image and the rest of the story. But if you can a little bit explain about.
Yeah, well, text is a part for Hoda Whitechapel and Nigeria heritage, and the kind of work he was doing, portrait work, a little bit documentary. It looks like the kind of thing you might see at a fashion magazine. You know, people are wearing great outfits, and the photographs are obviously designed to sort of capture that. And I don't really like calling him a vernacular photographer because it seems like he was working as a professional. He just wasn't getting commissioned in that way and by the UK press. So his family, he just gave up photography. He had a really good professional setup and camera equipment. So for those reasons, I don't think you can call him not professional. He just didn't make it. And that's what I mean about those barriers. There wasn't anyone looking for his kind of talent, permissioning that kind of work. And it was his family who found a stash of images, basically, and it's kind of implied there was more to it as well, that he didn't have everything. And that was then collected into autographs archives, and they do a job of finding and seeking out these kind of collections and putting it into their archives to exactly fill in the gaps, but also expose the gaps that exist where these kind of perspectives haven't been captured.
Yeah, I think like it's like the print itself was like very precious as well, the physical print, because again, like another story from my family all along is like when there was like a flood in our hometown when I was like I think 12 or 15, and I woke up and I saw my family rescuing the family albums, putting it on top of something before waking me up. But it was very funny too. And then I was like thinking about, oh, so we can buy the TV again. We can buy the house stuff. But the family album is like a unique thing. It's like very precious. There is no negative of them. It's like the one edition, so we're like hiding it. And I'm thinking about this with the digital world as well. Or how kind of like we saving those images. I mean, there's like this kind of like form of like cloud we're using it with. We do backup and everything, but there is also like form of risk. I think it was like a few years ago when the iCloud got hacked and there was so many like celebrity images were leaked. Um, but Carolina, you mentioned about temporal distance in your piece. I want to know about what is that temporal distance that you're referring to, and what's happened when that temporal distance or the gap collapse. Because in previous form of archive or like vernacular photograph, we produce the image, they're hidden for years in family archives, and then we found them and then we start looking at them, and there's few elements that we are very interested inside the photograph, but we don't have that form of gap anymore in digital maybe era. So I want to know if you can explain about the temporal distance.
Yeah. So I think what I meant with temporal distance was kind of the necessary time, but when this dislocation process happens, and so as I was saying, images outlive their owners, they get lost, they get found. So this is like kind of like a temporal. But then I was also thinking about, as I said, that we don't really print images anymore, and also the reason we take images has changed in the first place. I mean, there's many reasons, but for increasingly performative, if that makes any sense. I feel about the way I take pictures, and sure, there is an element of memory making, but it's mostly immediate social circulation. And I think there is an extensive reliance on this platform, whether that could be Instagram or Facebook, or it can be Google Photos, it could be iCloud. to store these images for us, and we don't really have to worry about it until the memory is full of them. We can buy some more space, so we don't really. And again, I'm generalizing. I'm not saying that this is happening. And it's kind of a speculation on what happens when all the images we take are kind of like, if it's for in social circulation, they're kind of destined to algorithmic oblivion, or just to sit in this, very non-material databases somehow. And what was interesting about Andrea's project is that it's kind of a form of resistance in a sense that it's self-archiving. I don't think she has any. She didn't really refer to her work as vernacular. That was my reading. But by doing so, she creates this portrait that to me is very vernacular. It's everyday because it's also how I message with my mother daily. And I think it's the shared experience of a lot of other people. So there's also this very big sense of community and something that can be either relatable or it's portrait of a wider phenomenon in society. And so yeah, that's what I was thinking, because before we would see this process of dislocation, there's these images, they get lost, they get found, they get shown. But now we're the only ones with access to our to this, right? So what if we lose our phone or our phone broke? Obviously there's passwords, there's ways, there's backups. Not every month.
I think the form of the risk is changed. Like
Yeah.
there was like a physical risk of like getting lost or damage.
Yeah.
Now there are like other forms like this with our phone.
And just really thinking about the infinity and taking the private chat as an example of where vernacular can happen. And it can be fostered and in Andrea's way by archiving it and showing it. It can be shared before it's condemned to be lost to, to get lost in the algorithmic oblivion.
And the lower you also mentioned about the Photoworks project archive, am I right? So it seems like there is like recently there are some like bridge platform in between maybe the archive or the images itself and the institution who work in vernacular that created in this like archive project or project archive.
Yeah, and the British Culture Archive,
Yeah.
they're more formalised. It's
They're-
a similar sort of, guess you could call it UGC, but people just submitting collections of photos they found their family, what they know about. And I did look at a couple of photographers from the British Culture Archive collections. It was very hard to pick someone that definitely seemed vernacular and wasn't just a photographer who did photography for a short while and then gave it up, because it's done at such a high level. It looks like this is just documentary photography. Again, not feeling right about calling that vernacular. But the British Culture Archive have this open way of allowing people to submit their collections, whether it's a family collection, one of the families eating sandwiches. That's one of the collections in the British Culture Archive, and also a bit of work and a researcher has solved it because they depict the same things. They've got a collection of a local woman who had taken the photographs, Punscott, Salford, and then Salford Archive kind of takes this idea of people just submitting work into user-generated Instagram context. So people are just submitting their kind of blurry images of things they found and then sharing it on the archive, from everything from, just the way the buildings used to be and streets aren't there anymore to kind of social events that used to happen there. But it's pretty much all people just submitting images they have, whether it's their personal collections and their family, or these painting clippings, that sort of thing.
It's very interesting because it's like happening everywhere. I know a few more examples of like small city or town that they have this form of like archive, and they asking like people from the city to submit their images. And I was thinking, because it's like kind of like revealed the magic of the photograph that we're seeing here. So I want to know that the kind of like relationship then the institution has in terms of like when they working directly with the archive, they curating it, there are meaning adds to that. But when we have these bridges, we already kind of reveal that magic of the photograph. So I want to know what do you think about the role of the institution, museum, or collections then?
Yeah, I mean, the British Culture Archive is like best in a way that it's geared towards addressing the fact that so many working class perspectives were excluded from documentation. So it invites those kind of perspectives people might have in the family archives and face up, if you call it an institution in the sense of it being like a museum, but it certainly has grown as people have added their own collections to it as well. And certainly Selbert Archives isn't an institution so much as it's a group of people who sort of bandied together as a kind of digital organization and built this picture of a place over decades.
Yeah, and because I think like at the same time, that's why I feel that the institution now become like kind of like secondary in terms of like shaping meaning into the vernacular archives.
I mean, I'm sure there's people with institutions here that could talk about that from their perspective, but from my perspective, I feel like a lot of these more grassroots organizations do a lot of work in elevating some of these photographers, so finding the work and then narrating it. Usually it comes with family narration about who this person was, when and how they were working, and the fact that it is like collected by the British Culture Archive or Autograph takes into their collection. I mean, the Balls Grange, they are actively trying to find these kinds of works that maybe the bigger collecting museums take it more seriously once it's gone through that layer of organization and storytelling around the work as well.
Interesting. And then I think when we talking about the vernacular, once it's in the hand of the author or the owner of the pictures, it's kind of like safe. There is like a safeguarding around it. Whether it's in your phone, where you have passwords, no one allows to check your album. It's like very personal thing. And when we have the photo, the physical album, there was like few people with access to it. So it wasn't something very for public in both way. But once it's coming out for the archives, for the collection, the main question I think it raises like the authorship and also ethic of the archive. I think like one of the example for the digital one was a few years ago with Richard Prince's project of the screenshot of the Instagram. It was very interesting because the images was already in a public space and then screenshotting those images, showing them, then raise that kind of like the ethics and authorship of the images. But Laura, you mentioning in your text about kind of Casa Susana project. If you can like a little bit explain about that to us.
Yeah, well, see, with the Richard Prince example, though, I guess it was more around content writer who owed the rights to publish those images, which also comes up with vernacular photography. I think people struggle with we find some great imagery, but can they publish it because he owns the copyright that he was owed, who is in the images all the time. But with Casa Susana's story, well, you might know the story, this house where a lot of people who were gender non-conforming might be recognized as transgender or transvestites now, just in terms of how they present to the world. You know, they were living in this house where they were able to express and experiment with their identity, and they were taking photos. They were using the photos almost, I feel like a lot of people who analyze the work feel is that their photos are almost helping to show them their identity. They're taking these photos, dressing in a way that they feel most comfortable, and their identity is almost being cemented and seeing themselves in that way. They're also just documenting themselves hanging out in this house. It probably worth giving some more context around the house, that it was this quite hidden away. It wasn't very accessible to the public. I guess people found it through networks and word of mouth, and it became, I guess, kind of a safe haven to express their identities in this way. And the snapshots are probably just family snapshots. So, you know, it's them hanging out in the grass on some May Day, happy dinner, just looking nice in a nice outfit, who kind of can be still hit quotas of today. And this was found. This was found by someone who was intrigued by it and looked into the history of it and verified that this house existed and that's what it was there for. And there has been a lot of ethical debate around what we're doing publishing all of that now, because these people wanted privacy and security because of the context of the world that they were living in at that time, wouldn't allow them to live that way in a more open way society, even still now, in some places. So I guess the fact that this has all been dug up and published and put in museums and magazines and books, that it raises the question of, is that okay to do? And yeah, I guess that comes up quite a lot, not only photography, but in other types of work as well, like diaries of the human share. Yeah, I mean, just recently, Joan Didion's diary was published, and a lot of people didn't like that because they felt like that wasn't a piece of work that she published with publication in mind. She didn't have, the audience wasn't her usual cuppa audience, it was for herself. And this must come up a lot in writing, in photography, go up into documentary, and I guess to talk about time as well. Like, there does come a point when enough time has passed where it feels more like anthropology, and can look back on Victorian era and see what they were writing in diaries, and it doesn't feel as invasive as someone just for generation or something. Yes, Cassie Susanna raises that because it's recent enough that it feels like invasive. And I guess a lot of the debate is around whether that's okay, that we've published it. We, the PEC, Timothy Wells, have published it and made it so available, these pictures that were private and specifically taken in a private context for safety, has been made so public.
Yeah, I think it was like also the same with the Abbas Sami, the Iranian diarist, or after he passed away. His son published his, he has this kind of like a calendar, and he wrote like notes on every page for every day. And it was like very personal note, like buying milk for my son or checking the grocery. It was very short notes for every day, but they scanned the book and published it. And it was interesting because his son, who has the rights to all of his work, published the book. But there was like a huge argument in Iran around, I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago, about even like his son has the rights of his father's work. But there was like, again, that kind of like personal notes and the needs to be published after your death, and if he wanted to be to publish those work. But Carolina, I think I want to ask the same question. I think because we sharing the images in WhatsApp, in iMessage, this kind of platform, and there is another risk that you can forward this image to everyone, can be circulated like millions of times if you're sending it to someone. Even it's like a very private space between you and someone else that exchanging the image, but at the same time it can be expanded over the internet. So I wanted you talk about those risks, and also like kind of the ethics of sharing image.
Yeah, I mean, I feel this could be like an endless a conversation that we could have. It's just like very layered and very difficult in this case is to establish what's ethical and what's not. Like, for example, with archival images, when does it stop being, something private, and when does it start being historical record in a way? I don't think that I have necessarily the answer to your question, but something interesting is that this with Martha's flowers, I realize how much and with like self-archiving and stuff, there is a lot more agency to share this word. In fact, Andrea was very specific about wanting both herself and her father credited as co-authors of the work. But I feel that kind of raises another question, and it's a question for me, for Andrea, because she didn't have any expectations of her work with Vernacular. Like, she just shared his work, and I named the association. But again, thinking about like what these future forms might look like, is this, if I'm archiving, am I allowed to say that my images are vernacular? Am I allowed, or do we need, is the figure of the collector necessary as someone external that looks at it without bias? Because again, with the way we take pictures, increasingly performative, that we're just going towards like a performative vernacular that makes any sense. And I don't know, and I think something interesting, it's also the limitations of the word vernacular, which Groza was hinting and Laura wrote very eloquently in your piece. That was really interesting. You quoted an author about that.
What was the quote?
About, can photographs just be photographs? And that using vernacular next to photography risks blocking, I'm saying it with my words up to and I, but like kind of like blocking vernacular with something much more bigger. So kind of the limitations. Yeah, you're right, can photographs just be photographs? And yeah, I mean, it's all questions after questions, but right, it's just,
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. Maybe that's something that we can discuss at the end. But I'm thinking because I'm seeing even like on Instagram or social media, I see like vernacular images of people who are not the author of the image, but they're resharing, reposting, or like there are different Instagram pages that they forwarded. Or I don't know, my friends send me a photograph of someone, right, randomly. It's forwarded to. So again, it's like kind of bringing this question, and it's very interesting because in Martha's Flower, the projects Andrea is like referring is the first thing is on Martha's Flower. So she's like kind of like including that form of like civil, that what Ariel Azoulay mentioned, the civil contracts of photography. We share a kind of like a respect within the people inside the photograph and the person who's making the image, and yeah, that was like that was very interesting. And then I mentioned this in my editor's note, I think, in for People's Picture. I was in Stonehenge a few months ago for curating an exhibition. I was sitting in the cafe um, working on my laptop, and there was this American couple in their 60s, I guess, talking about their images they took at the Stonehenge, at the circle. And the conversation was interesting because the woman was like searching the images and showing it to her husband, and she was like, I really like this image. And I think the image was blurry, but the man's in like eyes was closed or something. I couldn't see the image, but I was like listening. And she was like saying, I really like this image and I want to print this. And then was like, oh, that's like a kind of like a quality or the characteristic thing about in what happening inside the photograph between these two, that they want to end up having this image with all these kind of like errors that we usually avoid, closing eyes. I mean, the man wasn't really happy with the photograph, but the woman was like insisting that she likes the image. And she was like, I'm going to choose it. I was like really curious to see the photo. I didn't ask them, but I was like working on my laptop listening to them. That was like very interesting conversation that the photograph was for the photograph. That was like the main Kenny
Do you want to sell medicine gallery? You might go Stonehenge and take 50 pictures and then delete all but two because they're the nicest two where you look the best, or we've got all of us in shot. And I think that those are things that might be lost in the digital collective photography, is the kind of media editing that goes on with those images. Yeah.
I mean, I did the same thing. I think I posted something like a few months ago, and my friends buys this clothes, but I was like, oh, I'm a regret, so I'm gonna post it. It was, yeah, it's not nice, but you know what I mean. There are things that we are considering within the vernacular itself, and
I'm just wondering, is I'm just wondering if vernacular is something that like maybe someone that has a certain sensibility to photography, you know how to take a nice picture, you know how to frame it, you know how to take a nice shot. Like, could that be vernacular?
It's interesting because when I was researching on the new images of the protests in Iran, because we have this concept of like citizen journalists who are the protesters as well, going out doing the protest, taking pictures with their phone, and in I think 2 years ago in Photoworks, Anwar wrote a piece about the relationship in the poor image. But when I was looking at the images from recent, like last month, they were very like high quality. They were like having like a nice framing. The composition is very nice. The lighting is very nice. And I was thinking, these are the generation producing the image that they grow up with photography and they know about photography. Is more accessible. You watch a video for 5 minutes on YouTube, you get everything, and you don't need to play with the manuals. So you focus on the composition and lighting, become easy and accessible. And maybe that's kind of like thing that stopping you to accept the vernacular image, because in previous decades you were looking at those red eyes, the harsh flash, not very nice composition. Um, so I think the visual language is also changing. Yeah. And I think this is going to be interesting because we have more talks today and we're going to discover this more. But maybe I want to give a moment for you to dialogue to each other, and because I feel you talking about that kind of like acceleration in vernacular photography in digital world, the quantity. Why you, Laura, you're talking about those gaps and those like tiny small histories that the vernacular can fill in our history. I want to know how these two can like work together or like be against each other in terms of like the previous archives and nowadays.
I mean, they're linked in a lot of ways through digital because a lot of these images might have been found in a suitcase or an attic or somewhere. And the reason they exist in the way that we know them now is because they were digitized, put on a website, put on Instagram, and they're in there now. I don't know if in the case of some of these, like Soft Archives project, that anyone even has a physical archive, all those things, or they're just digitally submitted and recollated in this gallery on their Instagram page. So I guess they are digital.
Yeah, and then you were also wondering, you were also mentioning that even that there's always some perspectives that are lost anyways. So I am just thinking, is there anything that will be able to give us a comprehensive portrait of society eventually? Like, will this again, Murray?
But it has so many perspectives and add up to an objective.
Will there be an algorithm? I get now with algorithm difficult because there's companies behind and there's always some sort of like economical interest. So maybe not an algorithm, but like I'm thinking of a platform that like gathers everything and then it's able to like give us back a certain aesthetic, a certain an image of certain time, moment in time, if that makes sense.
I think it kind of is happening to a certain extent. And even now, the idea of 2000s photography has made a comeback of people, cool people, profiling these digital cameras on Vinted and Easy that I think I was taking my MySpace pictures with in 2008. And that's now what people are trying to recreate that exact aesthetic. So they're definitely, maybe it's like with fashion as well, and they just need to be out of it by a couple of years to be able to look back and say, oh, that was of that era. And we can see it now. It's been enough time since the early 2000s. People dig up with photography.
Yeah.
It might be that need a few more years to know what it is, but now.
Yeah, for sure. But it's very aestheticized. It's very like right now. It's all the images we take are inevitably curated for an audience. So I'm just wondering how this plays within the parameters of vernacular when it's, what we've known so far is just more self-expression than and memory making and self-documentation rather than, I don't want to say vanity, but just kind of appealing to someone in a way.
The very start of photography, it was a lot more formal. I mean, people are very stiff in those Victorian portraits, and very few specific families were able to afford to have those kind of photos, and they were done with a view that people were going to look at that. So maybe vernacular photography, as we're talking about it, is something that had happened. But in the meantime, you know, Buffy had been going for a while. Before digital came along and made everyone a photographer. But there was this moment of people having a private photography that was what we're calling vernacular. But actually, that's only that small amount of time in the history of photography.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I think that the paradox that I'm sort of writing about in my piece is, this collapse of the temporal gap. Is that even possible, or just time will tell? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting to think about, but I don't think we have the answer.
No, maybe that's pretend
Hopefully someone has the answer.
to open to the question. But I think that the last thing for me is, I think there is a kind of desire of showing the images that for decades we're trying to hide, that the physical album that we are always had. Maybe that's my experience. It's coming from different, I think, layers. But I remember that the family album was something very important. Like we hiding it always, and few people, family. But now we are like revealing this. I'm taking a picture of my sister's album and putting it on Instagram because I want to show it. Or the images I'm taking. Sometimes, it's very therapeutic for me to take pictures of my phone, of friends, drinking, everything. But I think there's form of desire these days with showing and revealing those images, whether from past or the images that you take nowadays.